Right here I have Anker's brand new F3800 Plus, and in this video we're going to do extensive testing on this power station. Now at first glance these power stations look identical, but they have made some significant changes to the new model, so let's go through those changes. One of the most exciting upgrades about the power station are these new solar charging ports. Now they have the ability to take in up to 165 volts and 1600 watts each. So you can get 1600 watts on each one of these ports for a total of 3200 watts of solar on the power station. The next upgrade on the power station is the ability to fast charge with 240 volts input. With this adapter here, the generator input adapter, you can get 6000 watts charging on the power station. That was not possible with the previous model. Now what's great about this as well is you can get full pass-through charging at 240 volts. Through this adapter or this plug here, you can plug in to a 240 volt source, whether that's a gas generator or a wall outlet, and then that will pass 240 volts charging into the power station up to 6000 watts, and you can get that full 6000 watts out through the inverter. So you can get fast charging and pass-through charging with this adapter. The best thing is they are only charging $50 for this. So if you purchase the power station within the first month, you can add this on for an additional $50. Now I really like the next upgrade to the new model, and it has to deal with DC input. So let's say you had a 48 volt battery and you wanted to charge the power station at night with DC input because solar isn't available. So what you would do on this one is you connect the 48 volt battery to one of these charging ports, you get around 1150 watts input. Now if you tried to connect the second charging port up to the same battery, it would completely stop charging because you could not have a common ground between these two charging ports. Now that has been completely changed on the new model. For example, if you connect up a 48 volt battery to one of these ports, you're going to get around 850 watts input, and that's because this has a slightly lower amperage input limit. But if you connect up a second port to the same battery, they now can share a common ground, and you're going to be able to charge at around 1700 watts from a 48 volt battery on both these charging ports. So that is a really cool upgrade to the charging on this power station. Now both the battery and the inverter are the same between these units. The battery is rated at 3840 watt hours of capacity. It's a lithium iron phosphate battery. And the inverter is both 120 volts and 240 volt split phase inverter, good for 6000 watts continuous. Now there are a few other slight differences, so let me show you some of those. This is the original F3800, this is the F3800 Plus. You'll notice that this had two 240 volt outputs, and they've actually gotten rid of that on the new model. They only have one 240 volt output, it's a twist lock L1430. And then they have this 30 amp connection here for 120 volts output. So I think a lot of people wanted that on the original model. So you can get 3000 watts through this or 6000 watts through that port. And then you have your traditional connections here, just like you have on this power station. Now the front of the power stations are exactly the same. Nothing has changed. You have a 12 volt socket, good for 140 watts. You have three USB-C power delivery ports, good for 100 watts each, and then two USB-A quick charge ports, and you have the same display. Now, if you look at this side of the power station, there are a few differences. We already talked about the changes with the solar charging ports. This is the original F3800. This is the F3800 Plus. Now, you'll notice that there's also an additional port down here. Looking closer at this port, you'll see a generator icon. At least that's what I think that is. And if we open this up, you can see that it shares the same connection as the expansion battery port, so high DC input. For example, if we open the expansion battery port, you'll see that it has the same input style. So I'm wondering if they have some future accessories that will use a high DC input, maybe a DC generator. That would be really cool on this port. Now with this new model, I'm sure you guys are interested in the launch price. Now they have the launch price listed at $31.99. So that's about 83 cents per watt hour. Now in order to sweeten the deal a little bit more, if you purchase the F3800 Plus at launch, they will include their Anker 400 watt portable solar panel for free. Now I already mentioned that you can pick up that generator input adapter for an additional $50, and they're also offering a transfer switch for an additional $100. So you can select which options you want, but the base price is $31.99. Well, now that I've covered the differences between the original F3800 and the new F3800 Plus, in the remainder of the video, we'll be going through extensive testing on this power station. We're going to see how the AC inverter performs with both surge loads, max load, and see how loud the fans are. We'll also be testing the USB ports and the DC output to see how much power we can get from that, see if it's different than the previous model. And we'll also be doing a bunch of charging demos, including that new generator input adapter. So let's jump into it. First, how does the power station perform under a max load test? I started by setting up a large 6,000 watt load on the inverter. After the test had been going for a few minutes, I moved my camera over to check my oscilloscope, and it was showing a high quality pure sine wave output, and I measured 121 volts at 60 hertz. After about 10 minutes of running that 6,000 watt load, the cooling fans were up to full speed. I measured between 52 and 54 decibels with my sound meter from 3 feet away. Next, I measured the air exhaust temperatures with my thermal camera. I saw a peak of 107 degrees Fahrenheit, which was actually one of the extension cables, but near the fan exhaust ports, it was measuring around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So the fans do a really good job of moving air through the inside of the power station to cool it down. My stopwatch soon hit the 15-minute mark, and the power station passed the max load test without shutting down or overheating. I turned up the load from the previous test till it got up to about 6,900 watts, and the inverter finally shut off. It's good to see the inverter does have a bit of room if you need to pull slightly higher than 6,000 watts before it actually shuts down. So in the next section of the video, we'll be testing the F3800 Plus inverter to see how it handles inductive or surge loads. Now in order to test this, I have this split phase adapter that's connected to 240 volt output, and I'll be testing one of the phases, which are good for 3,000 watts or 6,000 watt surge. So I'll be connecting up my appliances to this. I'll have a clamp meter on this wire here so we can measure the inrush current as we turn on these appliances. So for the first test, I have the 10 amp air compressor connected up. Let's turn it on and see how many amps it pulls. So we pulled a total of 22.64 amps. So we'll step it up to the 12 amp vacuum now. So I'll turn that on, keep an eye on the screen. Okay guys, check it out, 36.02 amps. So in the next test, we'll be trying the 15 amp table saw. So as you can see, no issues powering up that table saw. We pulled a total of 41.18 amps. Now in the next test, in an attempt to overload the inverter, I have the 15 amp table saw and the 12 amp vacuum connected up at the same time. We're gonna power these up and see how many amps it pulls and if it shuts off the inverter. So the inverter did struggle just a teeny bit to power up both those loads at the same time, but you can see we pulled a total of 45.39 amps and it did not overload. So in the next test, I have all three of those devices connected up at the same time. We're gonna measure to see if we get more amperage. I have this inline switch here to turn on the air compressor and the vacuum, and then I have the saw connected right here. I'll just flip them on at the same time. So let's see how much power we can pull. So we pulled a little bit more power, 45.83 amps. It did not overload the inverter, but there was kind of a pause there. So I'm guessing we got a little bit of voltage drop. So if you're looking to power up some large inductive loads on the F3800 Plus, you're going to be good for about 5,500 watts. That's as much as we are able to pull with all these devices connected at the same time. Now just remember, we are only connected to one of the phases of the split phase output, so one of the 120 volt outputs. You could technically connect up to both sides and surge almost up to 12,000 watts. Next, let's move on to testing the UPS cutover time for the F3800 Plus. It's advertised to have a 20 millisecond cutover, so let's see how fast it really is. Now in order to test this, I have the power station in UPS mode charging from the wall, and then I have my loads connected up to these three outlets right here, which are the UPS outlets. As I disconnect this from the wall to simulate a power outage, it should swap over to battery backup within 20 milliseconds. Now I've started a stress test on the PC, that's what this green screen is, and this is to simulate a load on the internal power supply of the PC. Now I'm going to be using this oscilloscope to record the actual cutover time, so let's get started. Now some power stations are extremely hard to catch the swap over time. I've tested probably about 15 times. Good news is the actual computer is still running, so the UPS works really well on this model. So what I've done is I've zoomed out a bit. So now you can see I have a bunch of waveforms here. We are going to try to record it out this far and then maybe zooming in. So let's see how this goes. So 3, 2, 1. Okay, I think we caught it, guys. I think we caught it. So on the screen, I was able to zoom in Between these two cursors is the actual cutover time, so you can see it kind of cut out right here at this point, flattened out, and then resumed right here. And that total time is 14.3 milliseconds versus the advertised 20 milliseconds, so it is faster. So I want to do a couple more on-screen recordings just so you can see that the computer is still running in UPS mode. So 3, 2, 1. Final UPS test, 3, 2, 1. So after all those tests, you can see the computer is still running, so the UPS mode works really well on this power station. So in my next test, I want to use my outlet tester here to connect to the inverter to see if it has an open or floating ground or a bonded ground. So I've enabled the AC inverter and plugged in my outlet tester, and you can see we have two lights here indicating that it does have a bonded ground. Now I have an adapter that plugs into the 30 amp 120 volt outlet just to see if it's wired the same, and it is. We are getting the same bonded connection. Now the original version of the F3800, whenever you were AC charging, only had these three outlets enabled. Now I've connected the AC charging cable on this model, and we'll verify which ones have power. So starting with these three outlets here. Okay, so we do not get power through these three vertical outlets. And what about the UPS outlets? Yes, you should have power through those. Yep, you can see we're getting power there. And what about this new 30 amp output? This is the RV connection. Okay, we're actually getting power through that, so that's pretty cool. We'll have to test to see how much power we can pull through this. Now I did confirm with my voltmeter that the 240 volt output here is disabled whenever you were charging with 120 volt input. Now, how much power can we pull from that 30 amp outlet as we are in UPS mode? The owner's manual states 1440 watts. I have 3000 watts of heaters connected up. We're going to slowly ramp them up until the inverter shuts off. So I have this large heater right here set to low mode. We're pulling right around 950 watts. So let's turn on one of these smaller 500 watt heaters. You're going to see a surge of power here, and then we'll let it taper off. So after about 30 seconds, we're sitting right around 1400 watts. So let's turn on the second 500 watt heater and see what happens. Remember, this is supposed to have a 1440 watt limit. We are surging here. We're pulling about 2000 watts. Okay, so you can pull over 1440 watts for just a few seconds, and then it's going to shut off from being overloaded. Now, just to summarize, whenever you are AC wall charging, you can pull up to 1440 watts, either from this port or these ports combined. How much usable capacity should you expect from the F3800 Plus inverter? The internal LFP battery is the same as the original model. It's rated at 3,840 watt hours of capacity. When draining the power station down until it shut off the inverter, I measured 3,270 watt hours of usable capacity, and this result is 85.1% of the advertised capacity, and is definitely a respectable result for such a powerful inverter and small battery combo. Next, how much power is used as the AC inverter is enabled and sitting idle? I started with the power station at 100% during this test and left the inverter on for 12 hours with no load. When I came back, it had dropped down to 80% state of charge, meaning that the inverter used about 20% of the battery over a 12-hour period, or about 1.6% per hour. And this is a slight improvement over the original F3800. Now, does the power station inverter create any noise or interference? Using my dirty electricity meter, I measured around 1820 millivolts of EMI, indicating that the inverter generates a mild amount of electromagnetic interference, but is that level actually audible? To test, I plugged my guitar amp into the inverter, and here's what it sounded like. Comparing the inverter output to wall power, you can see that there isn't any noticeable noise on the inverter. In my final test, I wanted to demonstrate how long the F3800 Plus could run half my house during an extended power outage. The power station was connected up to my 240 volt transfer switch with all 10 circuits enabled. Up on the screen, you'll see a breakdown of what's powered by that transfer switch. The F3800 Plus ran for almost 9 hours with 2% remaining in the battery when I ended the test. During this test, I saw an average of 300 all the way up to 600 watts being used, with the occasional jump in higher wattage as larger appliances were turned on. Now that's a decent runtime, and it could easily be extended by powering only critical loads, charging with solar panels, or connecting expansion batteries. Now, breaking down the results of the AC inverter testing, comparing the new versus the old, the results were actually very similar. The power output is very similar in each one. You can get 6,000 watts without the inverter shutting off. It had a very, very clean sine wave output. The fan noise is very similar as well. Actually, this model has slightly quieter fans, only by 1 or 2 decibels. The UPS mode is very similar. They're within 1 millisecond of each other. The biggest difference that I noticed when testing both of these was the actual idle power consumption when you had the AC inverter on. The original one was really close to 2% per hour, and this one's closer to 1.5% per hour as you have the AC inverter enabled. So it seems to be a little bit more efficient on the newer model. So in the next section of the video, we'll be testing the DC output and USB ports on the F3800 Plus. Now there really aren't any differences between the Plus and the original F3800. You have a 12-volt socket here. You also have 3 USB-C ports and 2 USB-A ports. Starting my test on the 12-volt socket, you can see it is regulated at 13.3 volts. Now how much power is available through this 12-volt socket? Well, I'm currently pulling around 137 watts. Let's see if we can go much higher. 141. And it overloaded. So about 141 watts before it shuts off. Now I'd love to see a move away from this 12-volt plug. These are very limited on the amount of power that you can pull. For example, we got a little over 10 amps. Right around 141 watts. I'd love to see something like an XT60 or an Anderson power pole port instead that can provide 20 to 30 amps. Now what about the USB ports? Well, using my USB tester, you can see the first USB-C port is rated at power delivery 3.0 at 100 watts. We're getting 20 volts at almost 5 amps. Now checking the second USB-C port, it is also power delivery 3.0 at 100 watts. Now what about the final USB-C port? Well, it's also rated at power delivery 3.0 and 100 watts, and that's what we're seeing coming out of the power station. Now it's definitely nice to have these 3 100 watt USB-C power delivery ports, but man, would it have been awesome to have 140 watt ports just like the Anker C300 DC? Well, maybe on the next version. Now what about the 2 USB-A ports? Connecting in my USB tester, we are getting about 5 volts at 2 amps, and the protocol is dedicated charging protocol. Even though it's listing 1.5 amps here, we are getting 2 amps. Testing the second port. Okay, it looks like we're getting the same thing, right around 5 volts, 2 amps, dedicated charging protocol. Now, how much power is available if we connect up all the USB ports at the same time? Now, if you look at the screen right here, we're pulling over 300 watts, and that's because each one of these USB-C cables are active, and then we're kind of trickle charging with these 2 USB-As. One of the coolest things about this Anker C300 DC version is that it has dual USB-C inputs, and we're charging at 187 watts. I love this little device. Now, I also like to make sure that you can use the USB ports and the 12-volt socket at the same time, so I have my battery load tester connected up and all the same USB devices as before. And if we zoom in a bit, you can see here on the screen that we're pulling about 440 watts with all the USB ports in use, and we can use the 12-volt socket at the same time. So you can definitely charge your mobile devices and power a 12-volt load at the same time. How much usable capacity can we expect as we discharge the power station? I admit I'm a bit crazy trying to discharge such a large battery through just a 12-volt socket, but I feel it's important to find out how much usable capacity you can get before it shuts down. The F3800 has an advertised capacity of 3,840 watt hours, and while draining the power station completely down until the DC output shut off, I was able to measure 3,523 watt hours, or a little bit above 269 amp hours. This capacity test ran for almost 30 hours. These results were 91.7% of the advertised capacity, which is very impressive to get that high of percentage on a large power station like this. Now, how much idle background power is used while the DC output is enabled? I started with the power station fully charged, with the DC output enabled, and checking in 12 hours later, it was at 98% state of charge, so the DC output uses about 0.16% per hour while enabled, which is very efficient. So from those DC tests, you can see that the DC output and USB ports are identical on both of these models, which is kind of a missed opportunity. I would have loved to see USB 140 watt power delivery ports here, and possibly a high DC output instead of this 12-volt socket. The reason I say that is because a lot of people like the form factor of this model to use in their RV, so they could have used the AC output to power that portion of their trailer or RV, and then if they had a high DC output, they also could have powered the DC portion of their trailer. So missed opportunity there for not upgrading the DC output or USB ports on this power station. So in the next section of the video, we'll be doing a bunch of charging demos on the F3800 Plus. We'll be testing DC input, we'll be testing AC input, we'll test dual charging and full pass-through charging. So let's get started. Now here are the charging ports on the F3800 Plus. Right here you have your AC input, which is designed for 120 volts and it's good for about 1800 watts charging input. And then below that you have your new DC ports. Now instead of using XT60 connections with a limit of 60 volts, they've almost tripled the voltage input. Now you can have up to 165 volts. So it has a voltage range of 11 to 165 volts with a peak amperage of 17 amps. Each one of these ports does 1600 watts for a total combined 3200 watts of solar input. Now it's great to see that they actually include solar charging cables with this model. This is the connector that snaps in and locks into place, and then it has MC4 connections on the end, so it's really easy to connect up your solar panels. You get one for each of those DC ports, and then right here you have your AC charging cable. Now an adapter that is not included with the power station but is available for purchase is this one here. It's called the generator input adapter. Now I requested that Anker send this out because I think this is very important for people to see. Basically, whenever you're AC charging the F3800 Plus, remember, it shuts off the 240 volt inverter. However, this adapter here allows for 240 volts input, and when you're using this, it allows you to keep the 240 volt output enabled. So you can AC charge and have 240 volts. So we'll be seeing how this works. I have not tested this yet, and that'll be included later in the video. So let's go ahead and test the DC input first. Now I've powered up my adjustable power supply. This is good for up to 1200 watts output. Starting the test at 13.5 volts, and I've set the power supply to 20 amps. And once it's connected up, you can see that we're actually charging at almost 17 amps. So this is around 218 watts. Now this is important to note. This power station does not come with a 12 volt car charging cable or a cigarette style charging cable. And that's good because it's actually allowing 17 amps input, which would probably burn up that connection. So if you want to charge off a 12 volt battery off one of the charging ports, this will actually charge fairly quickly at over 200 watts. Now what if you wanted to charge off a 24 volt battery? Well, I've set the voltage to 28 volts. You can see we're still getting 17 amps. And now we've jumped up from 200 watts all the way up to 465 watts. So charging from a 24 volt battery would allow you to get almost 500 watts charging input. Now what about connecting up a 48 volt battery? A lot of people use 48 volt batteries as DIY expansion batteries on these larger power stations. So I've set the adjustable power supply to 56 volts and it's still set to 20 amps, but we're seeing about 17 amps input. And looking at the screen, we're getting 941 watts input. So if you wanted to connect up a 48 volt battery, you'd see a little bit over 900 watts input. Now in my last test with the adjustable power supply, I wanted to simulate a high voltage solar array. Now this adjustable power supply is limited to 1200 watts and 150 volts output. So I've set it to 148 volts and around 8 amps. So right under the 1200 watt limit. And if we look at the power station screen, we're charging at 1186 watts input. So right at the maximum power that this is capable of. But it seems to be working just fine with having a simulated high voltage solar array. Now later in the video, I'll definitely be testing with real solar panels. Now one really great upgrade with the F3800 Plus is that it allows for the same charging source on both DC inputs. For example, I have both charging ports connected to this 48 volt battery. And as we look closer at the screen, we're charging at over 1700 watts input. Now that's really cool because this did not work with the original F3800. But now you can have a common ground between these DC charging ports, so you can actually dual charge from the same 48 volt battery. Now I want to go ahead and test the AC charging on the F3800 Plus. I have the 120 volt charging cable connected in, and in the Smart app we have it set to the 1800 watt charging level. Now what's really cool is you can adjust the charge speed all the way down to 200 watts. For example, if I save that in the Smart app, within a second or two, you'll see that it will drop down to 200 watts here on the screen. So if you want to adjust the AC charging, you also have the ability to do that. Now, what about dual charging, or the ability to connect both DC and AC input on the power station at the same time? Well, I've connected both DC inputs up to this 48 volt battery, and I have the AC charging set to 1800 watts. And if we look at the Smart app, you can see that it actually is prioritizing the DC input over the AC input. Instead of charging it a full 1800 watts, we're getting around 1500 watts input, and it is maxing out the DC input. So yes, this does support dual charging with AC and DC input at the same time. Now, if you remember from my previous testing, whenever you are AC wall charging this power station or in UPS mode with the 120 volt charging cable, only this 30 amp output and these 20 amp outlets are available. It shuts off the 240 volt and the remaining outlets. However, with this adapter here, the generator input adapter, we should be able to get the 240 volt output. So I've connected the generator input adapter to a 240 volt source, and we are charging at about 3,400 watts. So it is charging the power station extremely fast. But what type of outlets do we still have power on? Now, using my outlet tester, I want to see if we get power from these 120 volt outputs while we're using the generator input adapter. So testing this one here, okay, we do not get power out of those. Do we get power out of that side? Nope, we don't get power there. What about the 30 amp RV port? Well, take a look at that. We actually do get power out of this. Wait for the camera to show it. Okay, look at that. So we do get power out of this. What about the 240 volt output? Now, in order to test the 240 volt output, I'm using this splitter. So what it does is it splits up both of the phases into individual phases. So these two green ones here are one phase of 120 volts, and these two red ones here are another phase of 120 volts. So I can use this outlet tester to see if we have power. So while charging with 240 volts input, do we get power to one of the legs? Yes, we do get power on that side. Let's test this other side. Okay, we also get power on that side. So just to confirm, while using the generator input adapter, we do get 240 volts output through that outlet there, and we also get 120 volts output through this one here. Now, the generator input adapter comes with this L1430 twist lock. This is good for 30 amps at 240 volts. This is what you'd connect up to a gas generator or another 240 volt source. But I'm curious, if we can adapt this to 120 volts, can we still charge the power station with this generator adapter at 120 volts and get 240 volts output? So by using an adapter like this, which is an L1430 to a 30 amp RV connection, I want to see if we can charge the power station at 120 volts and keep the 240 volt output enabled. So I have the power station connected to the generator input adapter. This is connected to a 120 volt source using that blue adapter I just showed you. So now let's test to see if we get 120 volts output or the 240 volts output. So let's go ahead and plug in my outlet tester. Okay, so not 120 volts there. We do not get 120 volts there. What about up here? Okay, we do get 120 volts here at the RV connection. So now let's see if we get 240 volts output while having 120 volts in on the generator inlet. So we connect here. Okay, we do not have power. Let's connect to the other side. Okay, so we do not have power. So basic overview. If you're charging with 240 volts, you get 240 volts output and 120 volts from this outlet. And if you're using this and charging at 120 volts, you get 120 volts out through that port right there. So after all that testing, we know that whenever we have 240 volts coming into the generator input adapter, we get 240 volts output. But how much does it actually support? Like, how many watts can we run before everything shuts off? Right now, I have 240 volts coming in and we're charging at around 2,000 watts, and that's because the power station is almost topped off. So let's turn on these heaters and see what happens. So I've just turned all four of those heaters on low mode, and we are getting about 3,300 watts output to the heaters, and we're getting about 3,500 watts charging input from this adapter. Let's turn up the heaters and see if we can overload it. And turning up one of the heaters, turning up another one. Okay, 4,700 watts output, 4,900 watts input. Okay, here we go, full run. And that should be 6,000 watts output, pretty close to it. 6,000 watts almost, and almost 6,000 watts input. This adapter right here is a game changer. Now it was getting super hot in here, so I decided to turn off the heater so I don't roast. But why is this thing a game changer? Well, a lot of power stations that have 240 volt output do not allow charging at the same time as getting the 240 volt output. So this device right here, this generator input device, allows you to do that. As long as you connect this up to a source that can support up to 6,000 watts, which is 240 volts at 25 amps, it will charge up the power station and pass that power through to your loads. Now there's only one other power station out there that can just do this on its own without any of these adapters, and that is the EcoFlow Delta Pro Ultra, but it is much more expensive than this unit. So in the next section of the video, we'll be testing the solar input on the F3800 with two of my large solar arrays. So this one right here, this has four 400 watt panels wired together in series for 1600 watts. It has a peak voltage of around 150 volts open circuit. We'll connect that up to one of the ports. The next one we'll be connecting up is this one on top of my shed. This is a 1200 watt array. This has three 400 watt panels wired together in series. Now, because it is kind of in the winter, these aren't angled super well, so we aren't going to get peak output. And as for the solar conditions, we do have just a few high clouds. We just barely got past a ton of storms, so just a little bit of sun here to test with. We'll have to see what type of numbers we're getting. Now, as for the actual solar panels, they are routed through my house, through this, down into these DC breakers. And then I've temporarily disconnected two of these from my setup, and they're going into the F3800 Plus. So you can see those are connected to the charge controllers over here. So let's take a closer look at what we're getting on the input. So with both of those solar arrays connected up, we're getting 2200 watts input. So pretty decent for the solar conditions. In the winter, I usually don't see much more power than this just because of the angle of those solar panels. So here's a closer look at both of the solar adapters that come in the box connected into these ports. They both have MC4 connections on them, so they're easy to connect up to your solar arrays. Now, I love that it has the higher voltage, 165 volts for each one of these ports, and it will be current limited to 17 amps. So you can go over that 17 amps, but the power station will only allow 17 amps peak. So I love that this is about 100 volts higher than the previous generation. It gives you a lot of flexibility when wiring solar panels for the power station. Now, what about having solar panels connected 24/7 to the Anker power station? Sometimes in the early morning hours when the solar voltage is low, certain power stations will have a low voltage beep or alarm indicating it can't charge yet. When I tested this out on the F3800 Plus, there weren't any annoying beeps or alarms while having the solar panels connected all the time. It just started charging in the morning. I also tested having the power station completely turned off and then connecting solar input, and the power station turned on and started charging. So the panels do wake up the power station if it's died or if it has been turned off. So after doing all those charging demos, you can see most of the upgrades with the new model have to deal with charging. So much higher solar input with 3200 watts, and also the ability to have a higher input voltage makes it much easier to use with solar panels in series. You could basically have four 400 watt panels or larger in series and not hit that 165 volts. So very cool to see that. The other benefit is the ability to use the generator input adapter to fast charge the power station and also to get 240 volt pass-through charging. So that is a huge update over the previous model. And the final thing that I loved about it was the fact that you can use a common ground between the two charging ports, allowing you to charge from the same 48 volt battery. So you can technically have just a massive 48 volt battery bank, dual charge, and just dump that power into the power station at night when solar is not available. So huge updates to the charging aspects of the F3800 Plus. Now, of course, I put the new F3800 Plus through my power station grading system. It got a score of 9 points, or grade of an A-, so pretty respectable. It missed out on two requirements. The first one was because the price per watt hour was 83 cents. It missed out on the point for being under 80 cents per watt hour, and it also did not allow for more than 150 watts DC output, so it missed out on that requirement as well. So 9 points, or grade of an A-. Now that we're coming to the end of the video, I've showed you all the performance numbers on the new F3800 Plus and how it compares to the original F3800. Now, I feel like this is a much more capable unit, especially with the upgrades they made with the charging and using the generator input adapter. So I'm really curious what you guys have to think about the new model. So make sure you throw a comment down in the comment section. Now, if you are interested in purchasing this power station, make sure that you check back in on March 12th. Right now, this is not quite ready for sale. it will be for sale on March 12th or after. So I will include an affiliate link down in the video description so you can purchase from that link to support the channel. If you guys like the work that I do, all the in-depth testing and such on these power stations, make sure you purchase through that link so it supports the channel. Now, if you're someone that wants to connect up solar panels to either of these power stations or maybe even a 48-volt battery and you need additional guidance, I do have a basic consulting service that I'll include down in the video description. It's called AsqMe, and for a small fee, I can communicate with you and give you guidance on what type of solar panels to connect up, how to connect them together, what type of equipment you need to have a safe connection. So if you're interested, make sure you check out that service. Guys, I'll recommend a couple other videos that you can check out if you're interested in this type of content. Smash the thumbs up button on your way out, and thanks for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one.